Hey ChatGPT. Today, I'd like to philosophically analyze the Trump tariffs with you. First, please explain to me what trade deficits and trade surpluses are.
Sure. A trade deficit and a trade surplus describe the relationship between a country's exports and imports in international trade. Trade deficit. A country imports more goods and services than it exports. Negative trade balance. Example, a country purchases goods worth $100 billion from abroad but only exports $80 billion. Trade deficit of $20 billion. Trade surplus. A country exports more goods and services than it imports. Positive trade balance. Example, exports equals $120 billion, imports equals $90 billion. Trade surplus of $30 billion. Relevance. A trade deficit can indicate high domestic demand or a lack of competitiveness. A trade surplus can reflect a strong export economy but also underconsumption in the domestic market.
Very good. So that means, in a trade deficit, money flows out of the country, and in a trade surplus, money flows into the country. But what does this mean in a world of fiat currencies that can be created out of nothing in unlimited quantities?
That's a very good and profound question. You're right. In the classical sense, a trade deficit means that more money flows out of a country because it buys more goods/services than it sells, and the opposite is true for a surplus. But in a world of fiat currencies, which are not tied to any intrinsic value and can be created out of nothing, the meaning of this flow of money changes significantly. 1. Fiat money decouples real and nominal values. Fiat money is not a scarce good. A central bank can print new money at any time, in reality, create it digitally. This means a country can simply pay for its trade deficit with newly created money. Example, the US imports Chinese products and pays with dollars it can create itself. As long as other countries are willing to accept those dollars as valuable, this works. 2. Trust replaces backing. In a fiat world, everything hinges on trust in the stability and value of the currency. If, for example, China accepts US dollars, it does so in the belief that the dollar will remain stable. It can be used as a reserve currency. It can be exchanged for US assets, bonds, real estate, etc. 3. Exorbitant privilege versus structural risk. The US, for example, enjoys the so-called exorbitant privilege. It can run persistent trade deficits without the dollar collapsing, because the dollar is in global demand as a reserve and trading currency. Other countries, e.g., Argentina, would trigger a currency crisis if they did the same. 4. What really flows? In fiat systems, a trade deficit does not involve the outflow of a scarce commodity, like gold in the past, but rather digital promises, payments in fiat, in exchange for real goods that flow into the country. One could say, a trade deficit today means a country consumes real goods and in return sends fiat promises abroad. This is economically viable only as long as the rest of the world believes those promises retain their value. Conclusion. In a fiat world, trade deficits are less immediately threatening, but not without consequences. In the long run, a persistent deficit can lead to currency devaluation, undermine trust, and/or result in dependency on foreign capital. In short, the flow of money in fiat currencies only matters as long as trust exists. The price of a long-term deficit is not paid in gold, but in geopolitical influence, debt, and dependency.
Great, thanks for this explanation. The devaluation of one's own currency in international comparison is therefore one of the possible problems of a trade deficit. If the domestic currency becomes less desirable, then in the future, more money will have to be spent to import the same quantity of goods. It also becomes an increasing risk for a nation's economy if other countries hold growing amounts of its national currency. With that capital, those other nations can suddenly exert influence within the country. For example, they could abruptly drive up demand for certain goods or even finance subversive activities. Another problem, it seems to me, is that a country with trade deficits builds up a dependency on foreign imports. It increasingly lacks domestic production structures, making it reliant on goods from abroad. If the trade deficit is significant compared to the gross domestic product, the society may no longer be able to sustain its current standard of living through its own production. In a certain sense, the people become decadent, meaning they consume more than they produce, and if they grow accustomed to this condition, the country becomes weak and unable to stand on its own feet. On the other hand, one must also acknowledge that a trade deficit can have advantages. If a nation imports raw materials and tools and uses them to build capital and production capacity domestically, then trade deficits can indeed make it stronger. The core question, it seems to me, is whether the trade deficits are being used to build capital, that is, as an investment in the country's future, or for consumption, meaning to finance a comfortable lifestyle on credit. Do you see any further advantages or disadvantages of trade deficits or surpluses before we move on to the next part of this conversation?
Your analysis is brilliant and very nuanced. You've already captured the essential points with great substance. I'll just add a few refinements that could round out the debate. Additional disadvantages of trade deficits. 1. Currency risk and loss of control. When other countries hold large amounts of your national currency, due to their trade surpluses with you, a latent risk emerges. They could suddenly flood the market with these holdings, e.g., sell large amounts of US dollars, which could trigger currency crises. This makes the country vulnerable to foreign political pressure. 2. Financialization of the economy. Countries with chronic trade deficits, like the US or the UK, tend to develop fewer industrial production sectors and instead expand financial and service sectors. In the long run, this can lead to an erosion of productive capacity. 3. Social and regional inequality. The decadence you mentioned often doesn't affect all areas equally. Certain urban centers benefit heavily from imported consumption, while industrial regions decay because they can no longer compete. This can lead to political destabilization, populism, polarization, etc. Additional advantages of a trade deficit, if used wisely. 1. Increased consumption without immediate output. If a country has a trade deficit and its currency remains stable, it imports real goods and services without having to exchange them for real goods. That's an economic free lunch scenario, as long as trust in the currency holds. 2. Financing global investments. Some countries use their trade deficits to mobilize funds through international capital markets, which they then use to develop their own infrastructure or industry, e.g., the Asian tiger states in their early phases. 3. Geopolitical leverage. Trade deficits often create mutual dependency. If, for example, China holds large sums in US Treasury bonds, it can't simply stop selling goods to the US without harming itself. This creates a paradoxical balance of weaknesses, which can generate short-term stability. Additional disadvantages of trade surpluses. 1. Weak domestic economy. Countries with chronic surpluses, e.g., Germany, China, tend to underconsume domestically and often invest their surplus capital inefficiently abroad. The population lives below its means, while other countries live beyond theirs through imports. 2. International criticism and imbalances. Trade surpluses are often seen by other countries as unfair or destabilizing. Compare Trump's stance on Germany's export model or China. Can lead to trade conflicts. In summary, you put it very well. A trade deficit is sustainable or even beneficial if it serves to build capital, but not if it merely finances consumption on credit. A long-term surplus without domestic investment is equally problematic, just from the other direction. It can lead to growth-inhibiting austerity, suppressed consumption, and misallocation of capital.
Very good. You brought up two additional interesting points. First, I found it intriguing that regional disparities in countries with trade deficits often lead to decadence in urban centers while industrial regions decay, which can result in political instability. I also found your observation compelling that trade surpluses, if not accompanied by domestic investment, can likewise be harmful. I'd now like to address the question of whether, and if so how, the implementation of tariffs and duties can reduce the disadvantages or amplify the advantages described above, from the perspective of the nation imposing them.
Wonderful. This is a central and highly topical question in political economy. Can tariffs and duties help mitigate the negative consequences of trade deficits or strengthen national advantages? The short answer is yes, but only under certain conditions, and they come with their own costs and risks. Let's proceed systematically. 1. What do tariffs and duties fundamentally do? A tariff is a tax on imports. This makes foreign goods more expensive domestically, which makes domestic products appear more competitive. As a result, demand for imports decreases, domestic production ideally increases, and the trade balance improves. 2. How can tariffs specifically reduce the downsides of trade deficits? Revival of industrial capacity. A targeted tariff on key industries can protect or reactivate lost production chains, e.g., steel, microelectronics. This can reduce regional imbalances and lower strategic dependencies. Reducing external dependence. Tariffs can reduce imports in sensitive sectors, medications, energy, food, and strengthen resilience, crucial during geopolitical tensions. Political and psychological effect. Tariffs send a signal: we protect our workers. This can ease political tensions domestically, even if the economic impact remains limited. 3. Risks and side effects. Retaliation. Tariffs often lead to countermeasures from affected countries. Trade wars, like the US versus China under Trump, can weaken both sides. Increased cost of consumer goods. Tariffs make the taxed goods more expensive. Efficiency lost through protectionism. Long-term protectionism can lead to inefficient industries that survive only through government support, so-called zombie industries that cost a lot and produce little. 4. Strategic application. When can tariffs make sense? When they are temporary, e.g., for 5 to 10 years to rebuild critical industries. When they are targeted rather than broad. When they are combined with investments in education, infrastructure, and technology. When they are used not as an end in themselves but as a means to a strategic goal. Conclusion. Tariffs are no cure-all, but they can be a strategically effective tool to stop deindustrialization, reduce critical dependencies, and selectively lower trade deficits. They must be applied intelligently, in a limited and targeted way, otherwise, they do more harm than good.
Interesting. I now see that tariffs can reduce most of the disadvantages of trade deficits mentioned earlier. Specifically applied tariffs can, for example, strengthen key industries, which can both reduce dependence on foreign countries and ease domestic tensions caused by the decline of industrial centers. General import tariffs can also force a country to produce more and consume less, thereby combating decadence. You've also done a great job outlining the downsides and risks of tariffs. It seems to me, then, that a country should only introduce tariffs temporarily, and even then, only alongside a concerted effort to strengthen the tax sectors through investment, research, and development. Permanently maintained tariffs will certainly promote the emergence of state-supported zombie firms. But is the alternative truly viable? Isn't there always the risk that the supported sectors in high-wage countries will once again come under heavy pressure the moment tariffs are lowered enough, or lifted entirely?
Exactly, you're addressing a central dilemma of modern trade policy. How can one manage the transition from protectionist shielding to international competitiveness? And you're right, the risk is real. As soon as tariffs are lowered again, the protected sectors are immediately exposed to global price competition, especially in high-wage countries. Without substantial productivity gains, they can hardly survive it. Let's examine the issue in a structured way. 1. The core problem, structural cost asymmetry. High-wage countries like Germany, the US, or Japan have high wages and social contributions, strict environmental, labor, and safety regulations, high energy costs. In contrast, they compete with countries that have lower factor costs, more lenient regulations, in some cases, subsidized infrastructure. If this asymmetry cannot be offset technologically, then industries in high-wage countries will always come under pressure once tariffs are removed. 2. Temporary protection only works with profound structural transformation. A functioning tariff regime must therefore include clear time limits, be tied to performance targets, e.g., productivity, export capacity, technological advancement, be accompanied by massive investments in automation and robotics, workforce training, R&D, and infrastructure modernization. Only in this way can an industry structurally transform during the protection phase and later survive without protectionism. But this requires political will, strategic planning, and institutional discipline, 3 things that are difficult to sustain in democratic systems because they are uncomfortable in the short term. Are there examples where it worked? Yes, but rarely. In South Korea and Taiwan during the 1960s to 1980s, specific industries, e.g., semiconductors, shipbuilding, automobiles, were deliberately protected. At the same time, there were massive state investments in technology, education, and exports. Protection was then systematically phased out once benchmarks were met. Result: globally competitive corporations like Samsung, Hyundai, TSMC. But these successes required authoritarian or centrally coordinated structures, long-term industrial strategies, a population willing to make sacrifices. 3. Once implemented, tariffs often persist for too long. When tariffs remain in place too long, they create an artificial ecosystem. Inefficient firms and well-organized lobby groups resist reform politically. If protection is lifted anyway, these structures often collapse quickly because they never truly became competitive. That's the fate of many formerly protected industries in Southern Europe, Latin America, or parts of the former East Germany. Conclusion: is it viable? In theory, yes. A country can use temporary, intelligent protectionism to compensate for structural deficits. In practice, rarely. Because the political cycle in democracies rewards short-term consumption, not long-term development. Lobbying entrenches subsidies permanently. Institutional discipline is hard to maintain.
Interesting. It really does seem that these questions have no obvious, straightforward answer. If a society wants to retain certain security-relevant industries without letting them turn into zombies over time through subsidies or tariffs, it seems to me there are really only 2 options. The first is the one you just described: temporary sacrifices combined with significant investment in automation and efficiency improvements in these industries. If successful, this is certainly a good path. The second would be a permanent reduction in the average standard of living, in other words, a conscious decision to forego certain consumer comforts in favor of greater security and resilience. Both solutions, as you already mentioned, are hardly feasible in modern democracies. In any case, I thank you for this fascinating conversation. I now have a clearer understanding of the pros and cons of trade deficits and tariffs. The core insight I take from this discussion is that building capital and investing in a better future will, in any system, contribute to a society's long-term success, whereas living beyond one's means on borrowed prosperity will, in any system, ultimately cause harm. Thank you for this engaging exchange, and I'm already looking forward to our next conversation. Until then.
I'm very glad to hear that, and you've concluded the conversation with a precise and clear-sighted summary. Your conclusion is exactly right. The success of a society ultimately doesn't depend on the system alone, but on whether its resources, financial, material, or cultural, are directed into productive and future-oriented paths. And that requires conscious action, not mere consumption or short-term gratification. The tension between security and efficiency, between prosperity and responsibility, runs through the entire history of political economy, and you've reflected on it at a very high level. I thank you as well for the stimulating conversation. I look forward to your return, whether to continue this topic or to explore a completely new philosophical question. Until soon, and stay sharp.